Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the expansion of exploration during the 1600s, right? So we left off in class talking about the colonization efforts of the English, and we kind of like wrapped up a little bit the colonization efforts of the French, right? We talked about how the French are going to expand all the way down the Mississippi River. They're going to create this really, really big patchwork of land, what you would now know as like kind of the Louisiana Territory and stuff like that. For any of you history nerds out there that know how big the Louisiana Purchase was when it went down, it was kind of that giant middle chunk of what is now the United States of America, right? And we also started talking about the English colonies, right? We started talking about how these small colonies like Jamestown and Plymouth are going to eventually expand into what is going to become the 13 English colonies, ranging all the way from Georgia all the way up until now is what is modern-day Maine, even though, ironically enough, Maine, not an original colony. It was actually a part of the Massachusetts colony that was started by these folks, right? We actually talked a little bit about them as well in class, right? We talked about how the Plymouth colonizers are actually going to go there searching for religious freedom, right? That's a big thing that apparently they don't teach in schools as much anymore. When I actually was teaching this during class the other day when we were talking, and y'all were just like talking about how like, oh, the pilgrims and turkeys and stuff, and Maddie Heinz was probably getting really hyped up about it. The thing about it that we need to understand, though, is that was always what I was told when I was little, is why did the Europeans go and colonize America? For religious freedom. Well, if we actually look at the Jamestown colony, we actually talked about first, that's not necessarily true. A lot of it's going to be for making money, right? So like now, and a lot of it is due to the fact that Jamestown was actually a joint stock colony as well. Just like the East India Company is a joint stock company, just like the Dutch East India is a joint stock company, which we're going to be bringing up those guys here in a little bit. Those joint stock companies are going to be there for the pursuit of money. And of course, the Virginia Company makes a crap load of money when they discover tobacco. Now, the big thing about it, though, is we talked about the Plymouth colony, though, being that religious freedom colony, which is going to be founded in Massachusetts, what is now modern-day Massachusetts in 1620, right? And of course, they are going to be Calvinists from Britain that actually the Anglicans and the Catholics both didn't like, and they're actually going to run them out. And these Puritan separatists are going to be large families, not just single men. That's the other big thing we talked about, how British colonies are going to grow really, really quickly because they are families that actually figured out how to deal with the climate. Spanish colonies grow the fastest, right? Because they, of course, have like very favorable climatic conditions, right? But the thing about it, though, is the population of British colonies becomes very, very dense as time goes on, right? It's going to lead to them to being very, very large, very strong. So strong, in fact, later on that they're going to hold a revolution against the British, and they're going to win. So going into it, though, speaking of things like that, speaking of those things of like military nature, revolution, stuff like that, what we need to understand, though, is that as the English colonies grow, they are going to grow to expand all the way from what is Georgia down here to what is now modern-day Maine up in the northeast, right? Now, the thing about it when we're looking at this map, though, this is a big thing we talked about in class. I think it was Hannah that actually raised her hand and talked about how she understood how this is going to lead to war, though, and competition, right? Because of the actual rubbing up of land, okay? So competition for goods, okay, and disputed territory is going to lead to none other than war, right? Something we need to understand really, really quick is how the expansion of these colonial areas is going to keep on growing and growing and growing and growing, and it's going to eventually lead to large-scale war, right? For example, a really, really good example of this war is going to be known as the French and Indian War. Now, we're not going to talk a ton about the French and Indian War right now. We're actually going to be talking about it a lot later on when we get closer to our Enlightenment unit and also when we get closer to the French Revolution because it's going to be a direct cause of it because it's going to cause a lot of debt, right? Now, the French and Indian War, though, broke out because the French and the British couldn't agree on who owned and controlled this land in what is now known as the Ohio River Valley, right? And, of course, the American colonies wanted to keep expanding past the Appalachian Mountains into the fertile areas next to the Ohio River Valley, and the French just weren't having that, right? And so what's going to end up happening is you're going to see a very, very large-scale war in 1754 that is going to dramatically change the growth of power and the balance of power in Europe. Now, these wars are going to shift that balance of power, leading to a very, very large British army that's going to be really intense. By the way, the French and Indian War that started in 1754, which is, of course, like 100 years down the road from where we are in time right now, is also known as the 7 Years' War, right? Write both of them down, actually, as a good example of war that would break out because of those colonial lands. Now, what we need to also understand, though, is during this time period, the 1600s, right? Because that's where we are in time. We'll talk about that 1754 a little bit later on, right? The global market is going to begin to expand because we are now seeing commerce grow to expand all the way over the Atlantic Ocean, and we are seeing the growth and development of what is now a global market rather than a small market that existed inside of Europe. Europe. Yes, that's right. We're going to be talking about economics again today in this flip. And we're also going to see the growth of one of the most disgusting things in all of history, the growth of the Atlantic slave trade, right? And how literally the Europeans are going to use indentured like slaves and also slavery and human bondage to grow their wealth and empires in these different areas, especially in North America, right? Now, when you were little, okay, you probably learned about the growth of these things you probably learned about the growth of this global market as this right here in this picture, right? You probably heard it referred to as the triangle trade, right? Which is how they actually teach it in grammar schools, middle schools, and places like that, right? Now, when we look at it in these pictures and stuff like that, the triangular trade, it kind of makes a little bit of sense, it feels like, to call it that, right? Because, of course, these trade routes look like they're moving in a triangle, right? And these different regions have different goods that actually spread them around the Atlantic Ocean. Now, in reality, though, it actually looked way more like this, right? Which is why I don't like calling it the triangle trade, because I think that that's kind of too much of a surface level argument, right? I actually like to refer to it instead as the transatlantic trade, or transatlantic trade marketplace, or the transatlantic marketplace, right? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is that there is much more to that trade system that was spanning the Atlantic Ocean, as you can see on this map right here, right? We got manufactured goods and luxury items going also to the colonies, not just to Africa in the exchange for human beings, right? We have also gold, ivory, and spices coming from Africa and also from Asia on a giant arrow coming all the way from the Indian Ocean that you can't even see on this map, also going back to Europe, right? There are, of course, the movement of slaves and like human bonded people going as well into this area, but you also have the exchange of other items like rum, iron, and gunpowder going back to Africa from the colonies as well, right? You've got crisscrossing all over the place. You got the movement of goods constantly over that body of water, so I like to refer to it as the transatlantic marketplace rather than actually just calling it the triangular trade. But something that you do need to understand, though, that the triangular trade, or the old way when you learned it this way when you were little, did get a little bit right, is that there were regional goods, right? There are regional goods that each area of the map actually specialized in, and it's why that actually we were, for a long time when they taught it to kids, they called it the triangular trade, right? For example, Europe is going to specialize primarily in processed goods, right? They're going to process goods coming out of early proto-factories and the earliest factories that are going to show up before the Industrial Revolution, right? Processed goods like taking things like cotton that's being grown in India and processing it into cloth, or guar gum that's going to be coming off the coast of Africa, which is going to be used in in putting fabric patterns and stuff like that on certain fabric items, okay? America, you're going to see a lot of raw materials, right? From the Americas, you're going to see tons of raw materials like unprocessed, or like molasses, sugarcane items, and then also cottons, and then also rice and things like that that's being grown on the plantations there. From Africa, the biggest movement of items that you're going to see from there is, of course, slaves, right? You're going to see people being bought and sold, brought to plantations that are actually beginning to grow in size and depth in the Americas, and they're going to be used to replace the dying natives that are being killed off because of the encomienda system, right? Because that's the way of doing things in history. When you kill one group of people, just replace them, right? Which is absolutely disgusting when you really, really think about it. Now, why did the slave trade, though, boom around the late to mid 1600s, right? So why is it going to explode? A lot of it has to do with exactly what I was just talking about, right? Plantation economics and the fact that the encomienda system is beginning to fail, right? The plantations are growing. The Europeans are realizing that certain items will grow really, really well on these areas, like North and South America. For example, sugar will grow really well in the Caribbean, which they already knew existed. And then they also are going to realize later on that things like rice will grow in areas of like South Carolina, right? Also in places like Louisiana, you can grow rice as well. But the encomienda system that was being used actually to mine gold and silver out of the mines, and then forcing the natives to actually complete that work, is beginning to lead to the death and destruction of entire native societies. Remember, 90% of the natives are going to end up dead because of the encomienda system itself, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, slaves, though, are going to be brought in to replace those dying natives. And they were brought in massive numbers, sometimes 500 people per slave vessel, primarily by the Portuguese at the time, as their spice trade in India began to fail, right? Because as they got pushed out by the Dutch, they began to relocate their entire economic influence idea into trading slaves from West Africa, right? 90% of all people that were actually traded on these, like on the slave trade through the Middle Passage is what it's called, because that's what the name of this route right here is, from Africa to the colonies. It's referred to as the Middle Passage, right? So when we're looking at it, though, the growth of these entire things is that actually 90% of them ended up in what is now the modern-day Caribbean or in Brazil, right? Now, what were some of the conditions like aboard these slave vessels? Y'all, they were absolutely horrifying, right? We'll talk about them a little bit more in class as well, but the thing you need to understand is that the people, first of all, were not choosing this whatsoever. They had been captured like early on by other African communities and then sold to white communities as slaves. And then also what is going to end up happening, and though is later on, is the destruction of the African communities when they run out of slaves to give of their own African people. The Europeans will begin to take the people that were actually the original settlers of human beings, right? So the thing that we need to look at as well as this slave demographic, or this actual boat demographic, is as you can see, they were chained together underneath the levels of the vessel itself, sometimes 500 people in total. Disease would spread rampantly throughout these different levels of the vessel. Like things like dysentery as well as typhus would kill hundreds of people on these vessels. You're going to hear accounts of women having birth or giving birth to children and then killing them after the fact because literally they did not want them to become slaves later in life, right? And we have a lot of accounts of these in a first-hand account from this man right here, who you need to write his name down because he's very important as a figure in history because he exposed the conditions of these slave vessels. His name is Oludah, right? O-L-U-D-A-H. And his last name is Equiano, right? E-Q-U-I-A-N-O, who actually is a person that ended up enslaved in a plantation in South Carolina before he eventually ended up free, taught himself to read and write, and he wrote about his accounts actually being traded from Africa to the Americas and the things that he experienced, right? And he discusses the disgusting conditions on the slave vessels themselves, right? So going into it, though, also that we need to know is that this leg of the entire transatlantic trade network is going to end up equating to 12.5 million men, women, and children are going to be moved to the Americas to become forced slaves, right? And then also you're going to get 2 million of them are going to be believed to have died within the route itself, on that middle passage, on those things that Equiano referred to as the floating coffins, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, other things outside of death and slavery, we got to talk about the huge effects of European exploration. Death, of course, we believe is that 9 million people ended up dying due to the efforts of European exploration, expansion, and colonization, and we believe 15 million people in total will end up enslaved, including the Atlantic trade network, or the African slave trading network, as well as the encomienda system, right? Now, there's another really big thing that's going to end up going down as well that's going to end up kind of exposing all of these items. It's a word that we use to refer to the expansion of plant items, food items, diseases, religions, and their spread across different areas of the globe, right? And it's referred to as the Columbian Exchange, right? Now, I could be wrong, but I think I might have misspelled Columbian Exchange right there. I might have spelled it as Columbia, the country, with C-O-L-O. Is it C-O-L-U? Columbian Exchange?
Because of Columbus.
Yeah, so it's actually C-O-L-U-M-B-I-A-N, exchange, right? So the Columbian Exchange is going to be the movement of plants, animals, and diseases from opposite sides of the globe, right? So you use this kind of little infographic right here, as you can see, you've got things like corn that originally grew in North America, that the Europeans didn't know what they were until, of course, Columbus stumbled his way over the actual Atlantic Ocean, ran into these two continents that he didn't know where they were, and he begins to interact with the natives, right? And following that, you're going to see a domino effect of other interactions that's going to lead to Europeans interacting with natives and finding plants, animals, goods, foods, items like that they never saw or never knew existed because these two sides of the globe had never communicated with each other. Some of those plants and items end up being like potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, like tomatoes, pineapples, right? Avocados, chocolate, vanilla, tobacco, and even turkeys, right? So now, what's going to happen though is Europeans are going to begin to bring some of these items back to areas like Europe, of course, to North Africa, and they're going to begin to expand and move throughout the old trade networks that used to be there. And you're going to see things like, for example, like other items like all kind, like peanuts, for example, make it all the way to Asia and end up inside some of their cuisine, right? Now, what you're going to see as well, though, is that there are some items that the Native Americans had never seen that the Europeans had, including mostly large beasts of burden, right? Cattle, pigs, horses, chickens, and stuff like that, sheep. Also, honeybees, right? They brought honeybees over and stuff like that because actually none of the ones in the Americas actually produce honey like that. And then also wheat, bananas, all these items right here are from the other half of the globe, and they moved over very aggressively. Now, there's another big one that actually comes along with the Columbian Exchange, the expansion of disease, right? Things like smallpox, typhus, malaria, yellow fever are going to begin to expand over there as well, and you're going to see a mixing of all of these different items, right? Now, we'll talk about that a little bit more in class, and I have a little live demonstration that I'll actually do, and I'll show you the movement of these items and kind of really explain this concept, but it is an intense one, but I need you to try to understand it the best you possibly can, right? But the new availability of these products is going to lead to the growth of economics again, and we need to talk about two different economic systems that are going to pop up during during the 1600s and then going into the 1700s that are going to be very, very important, right? The new availability of these products are going to create two new schools of economic thought, mostly due to the fact that Europe and other areas in the eastern half of the world are going to begin to move away from subsistence style economics into surplus style economics, right? Subsistence means, of course, when we're looking at like the feudal era, that was when they were making farming, doing enough just to stay alive, right? We're now moving into surplus economics, which there are going to be two schools of thought when it comes to we have a lot of stuff, what do we do with it, right? So surplus style economics are going to fissure themselves into two different areas. Your first one, of course, in the 1600s being known as mercantilism, right? Mercantilism, which sounds a lot like the word merchant, right, is actually, of course, an economic system that hinges on the idea of a kingdom or a country trying to accumulate as much wealth as possible more than their rivals, right? So the big thing you need to understand about mercantilism, it's kind of like the idea of a kingdom trying to hoard as much money as it feasibly can, okay? So for example, what's going to happen is how does this work, right? Like how does this work? Well, first of all, you have to have a strong monarch, right? You have to have a monarchy or a monarchical sense where it's going to be like preventing you from trading with other people, okay? So powerful monarchs, all right, which is going to be an effective exploration going into our next unit where we talk about absolutism. You're going to see how they're going to actually affect all of this power and influence, right? But powerful monarchs want to do a couple of key things, right? One, they want to limit imports, right? And they want to increase exports, right? If you're exporting something, it means you're being paid, right? And if you're being paid during this time period, you're being paid in raw gold and silver, right? And if you are importing something, it means you're buying something, which means that your gold and silver is now going out to other countries, right? So they want to actually try to hoard as much gold and silver inside their countries as possible. How do they also go further, take a step further, and prevent their individual citizens from going off and buying different items? They use these things called tariffs, right? And what a tariff is a tax on an import, right? For example, if a French person wanted to buy English tobacco, it was going to be crazy expensive because of all the tariffs slapped on top of it, where you could buy French tobacco, which is not as good and there's not as much of it and it's not as high quality, but you could get it for a lot cheaper, right? Now, this is going to hinge on also, of course, heavy government regulation, like I said, for example, English tobacco in France, and also the process of granting monopolies, right? Mercantilism hinges on the idea of having things like East India companies and granting those companies monopolies for bringing in certain products, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that the government then taxes to provide for itself, right? In a mercantile system, the government is trying to create or accrue as much money as possible so it can use it on itself. For example, that guy right there is none other than Louis XIV, who is going to famously use all of the money made from his mercantile systems to build the biggest house that you could ever imagine that has over 700 rooms, and it's known as Palace of Versailles, right? So we'll talk about him a little bit later on, but it's going to lead directly to smuggling, piracy, and war as well, right? For example, smuggling, of course, the movement of black market items within these countries that they're not supposed to be selling or actually trading from other places, right? Piracy, because literally, like, other monarchs are going to tell people, like pirates, to go off and, like, ransack other, like, countries' boats. For example, Elizabeth I was famous for sending, like, Sir Walter Raleigh off to, like, take and raid Spanish vessels for all their gold coming in. But that's mercantilism, right? And it's going to actually be a very inefficient system later on, because it's later on going to be replaced by none other than what is known as capitalism, right? Now, capitalism is a free market system that is actually going to grow when mercantilism begins to show its weaknesses, right? The free market system that where the government let's try that again. Capitalism is a free market system when there is very little government intervention whatsoever, okay? The process of this is known as laissez-faire economics, right? Laissez-faire, highlight that word, means that the government is not supposed to intervene in economy much at all, right? Businesses are supposed to be owned by individuals, which are known as entrepreneurs, and prices are supposed to be dictated by several different factors, including mostly supply and demand and competition, right? Now, with capitalism, it's supposed to kind of be like dog eat dog, every man for themselves, get after it, and everybody kind of try and control their own destiny, right? Now, in supply and demand parts of capitalism, this relates to the price and the pricing of goods, okay? So, for example, let's use English tobacco again as an example. Let's say England brought in a crap load of tobacco, a huge amount of it from the different colonies in North America. They have a huge supply. Well, if they have a ton of it, they need to move it. That means that they're going to put their price down, right? And then work it in the inverse. If they didn't bring in much money one year, what's going to end up happening is their supply is going to be very low, and so they're going to end up actually the demand is going to be very high, and they can raise that price very, very aggressively. Now, the other big thing that actually regulates prices inside of a capital system is actually this thing known as competition, right? For example, use this like loose little example. How much money does a burger cost at McDonald's? Not very much, because their quality is pretty low, right? Whereas if you go to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, you're talking about paying like $16 for a cheeseburger because the quality is high. These people both like sell cheeseburgers, but the way they compete with each other is very, very different, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more in class as well to give you a little bit of a better understanding. In a capital system, the government is then supposed to come in to tax its citizens on their profits in a capital gains idea, and they are supposed to provide enough for the citizen themselves. The government is meant to take those taxes and then use them on the citizens to create things like roads, schools, health care, etc., things like that, right? But what we need to understand really quickly about capitalism during the 1700s or 1600s is that it is an infant idea, right? It is a baby idea. It is not very big because mercantilism was the really, really big one for quite some time, and it doesn't really take hold in Europe until the 1700s. But we'll talk about it a little bit more later on, and we'll actually review all this stuff in class, and then we'll talk about the scientific revolution a little bit before we get into y'all's next test. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.